Hello and welcome to the CX Files for June 1st, 2023. My name's Mark Hillary and I'm in the UK right now for once.
And I'm Peter Ryan. I'm also in the UK with Mark at CX Outsourcers. Mark, can you believe that another successful event has come and gone and that we are literally halfway through the year?
Yeah, absolutely. Can't believe it's June already. Where is this year going?
I ask myself that around this time every year. It just seems like H1 flies by and H2 goes by even faster. But we're actually today going to be providing an interview that is fascinating for a number of different reasons. Now, it's with Barry Winkless, who is the Chief Strategy Officer at CPL. And Barry gives us a lot of interesting insights around the future of work. And much of it was based on a presentation I saw him deliver back in April at the Pro Progressio event in Warsaw, Poland. Now, as I mentioned during the podcast, Mark, when he was presenting, you literally could hear a pin drop in the room. Barry was bringing some very cutting edge ideas and a lot of common sense discussing the future of what the workplace and the workforce is going to look like. And you sat in on the interview and you jumped in a few times to ask some questions. It's a rarity that you and I do a tag team, but today was a lot of fun. And, maybe if you could just give a couple of your impressions about what Barry brought to the table, I think that would be a nice way of segging into the interview.
Yeah, I think what's really nice is that he's actually exploring the future of work from the perspective of what's really happening and what's demonstrable and provable rather than what's in the headlines. And a good example there is, as you'll hear in the interview, he makes a big distinction between tasks and jobs and workforce and workplace. So a lot of this is all confused in the media discussion when we're talking about remote work or flexible work or AI replacing jobs. And so I think that, Barry's more sort of thoughtful approach actually gives us a much better idea about what's really happening.
Yeah, and I would say that somebody like Barry does come to the table with a real world sense of what's happening, just considering the fact that CPL is one of the largest staffing agencies in Western Europe, if not the world. They've got a huge legacy, and it's not just a placement agency as such. They do a lot of their own research. They do a lot of research trying to get insights into how employment and how employees are going to be evolving over the course of the coming decades. And really, I think that's one of the things that drives the value in a talk from somebody like Barry, whether it's at a conference or in a podcast like today.
Yeah, absolutely. And we got, some great insight from him. But of course, this weekly format is quite short. So I think that what we need to do is maybe do a longer format in a few months, get some other deep thinkers like our friend Steve Lloyd, and maybe do something exploring the future of the contact center, perhaps.
Yeah, that would be a very good idea. And I think certainly would drive a lot of interest from listeners around the world because these are very salient topics when it comes to CX. If you're not able to recruit and manage your workforce accordingly, that's going to have an immediate impact on the results of interactions with customers. It could be frontline in person, maybe at a restaurant or in a retail outlet, or perhaps at an airline check-in kiosk. It could be over the telephone. It could be a digital interaction. But the bottom line is there's a lot of investment in both resources and time that need to go into workforce management. And figuring out exactly how the workforce is going to evolve if we're going to better equip organizations to do the best that they possibly can with their end users. Well, this is a very special CX Files this week because we're fortunate to be welcoming three individuals on this call who are not only, I would say, very, very much engaged in what's happening in the CX and the BPO space, but all three of us hold Irish passports. And that is a rarity these days in terms of getting such a distinguished group of people all on one Zoom. So this is also a rarity because Mark Hillary is joining me to do a tag team interview with our special guest this week, Barry Winkless. Barry, you join us from your office in Dublin. Great to see you.
Great to see you too, guys.
Now, Barry, you and I had the occasion to meet in Warsaw a few weeks ago, where you were a keynote speaker at the Pro Progressio conference put on by our mutual friend Victor Doctor, and truly an amazing conference it was. I'd be curious, maybe to just start off, if you could tell us a little bit about your job role, what you do, and maybe a little bit of the focus in your role currently.
Yeah, no problem, Peter. Like, I got three roles really within my current role. So I like to say, they're getting the price of three for the price of one. But anyway, my first role really is to work with my CEO and my executive team to deliver our 5-year strategy in terms of our growth plans for CPL across Europe and into the US and Canada. Actually, funny enough, Peter, I know that's your lovely homeland. So that's the first thing, and ultimately my role is to make sure that that is on track, and we are making sure that we're hitting our targets, we're hitting the various key stages that we agreed as a leadership team. So that's the first part of the job. Second part of the job is I'm responsible for our brand and marketing activities within the broader European area. And then finally, I also head up the Future of Work Institute. And the Future of Work Institute is a research and advisory group that really delivers value-added insights, research, pilots, and projects for many of our more than 4,500 clients across Europe and across the globe. So they're my three roles, and actually each of them have a really nice synergy between them, because obviously the Future Work Institute was actually agreed as part of our overall strategy, which was how do we help our clients and many large clients across the world be future ready? How can we make sure we are giving them the right perspectives, the right insights, the right thinking, the right processes to help them really thrive in the future of work?
Okay, now this is really interesting because the future of work in the context of customer experience management is something that's coming up a lot. We know that attrition is really taking a hit right now. We know it's more difficult to recruit qualified people into frontline or even supervisory roles than ever before. So with that in mind, Barry, can you talk a little bit about what some of the key messages were about the presentation that you delivered in Warsaw?
Yeah.
And if I could just give some context here, when Barry was speaking, literally you could hear a pin drop. Everybody was very engaged because it was some really cutting edge stuff. But if you could talk a little bit about what you see as the maybe three most salient points you were getting across in Poland, that would be a great point to start off the discussion.
Yeah, no problem, Peter. Look, I think the first big point is for leaders to recognize that the future of work actually represents the next collaborative advantage. Now, I use that word collaborative, on purpose, because I'd say we're moving out of the world of competitive advantage and into collaborative advantage. And we're actually in a world now where we can't really do much without working with suppliers, without working with our people, without even working sometimes with our competition in order to drive change forward. So I think the first big point for me, Peter, is actually that the future of work really represents a collaborative advantage for leaders really willing to embrace it and look at it in what I would call a connected way, which leads me on to my second point, which when we talk about the future of work was really interesting to me, as many people don't even know what they're speaking about when they talk about the future of work. So I think the second point I'd like to make is the definition, or our definition based on a 2-year research program, what the future of work is. And for us, for organizations, that means the design, integrated design of the 3 W's of work in the context of business and society. And those 3 W's are workplace, workforce, and work task. So workplace is where the work is going to take place physically or digitally. Workforce is how we need to design our workforces in different ways to create, different opportunities, and how do we motivate that workforce. And then work task really is about the technologies, the tools, and the processes that actually deliver that work. So if you really think about it, a lot of the focus is often on what I would call the workplace, right? Flexible working, where should we work, blah, 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 blah. Actually, interestingly enough, all 3 are equally important. And I would actually say, if you look at something like workforce innovation is a massive potential for organizations. And what I mean by workforce innovation is, what are the right types of employment types we should use for different types of work? So for example, if I'm a technology startup and I've maybe got 150 people, do I really need a permanent workforce? Or actually, could my whole R&D department be fully contracted out? Or could I have my whole R&D department made up of 12 contracted individuals working together for a 2-year period until I'm into my growth phase of my organization? So, there's so many opportunities for leaders. But the second big point for me is to think about it in a connected way. So that's my second point, I suppose, in terms of the talk piece as well. And I think the third piece for me is leaders as designers. And this is something that I'm very passionate about, which is for leaders to recognize that part of their role is actually to design a better world of work. Because fundamentally, often the organizations for the last 200 years, some leaders within those organizations have been the ones that have pushed forward, how we work. And they've even sometimes been ahead of society in terms of the kind of innovations that they put in place. So if you go right back to even Cadbury's back in the 1800s, they were the first organization to create a model village for their workers to improve their health, to improve their overall well-being, and how they actually turned up for work. So the third piece for me is leaders as designers of a better working world. So they'd be my kind of three core points ultimately.
I'd be interested in just asking you there then, because you've distinguished between workforce, workplace, and work tasks. Is this one of the mistakes that we see in the media when they say that AI is about to take all our jobs? There's another headline today, I think, as we're recording this, about British Telecom. And it seems that actually it's the tasks that are being replaced rather than the jobs. Wouldn't that be more accurate?
Yeah, that's a really interesting point, Martin. Actually, it's a really good point. I want to call that out because in our world, we see those three W's as very much interconnected, right? They interconnect, they overlap, and they actually can synergize with each other. And I think you're right. There's a lot of scaremongering actually around technology, and yourself, big titles, because big titles sell newspapers. If I look at our own research in the area around AI, what we're really seeing, to be quite honest about it, is the age of augmentation. And I think the organizations that are really using technology well, Peter's more of an expert in the outsourcing space on this in mind, but in terms of the broader organizational perspective, where we're seeing successful organizations is that marrying of the abilities of human beings with, supplementing with the right types of technology for the right types of challenges that organization has. So you're absolutely right, Mark. I think, we need to move away from these sensational headlines. And, obviously there are worries around AI because it is ultimately a learning technology. And, we should always be mindful of that. But equally, I always like to stand back and say, guys, we make the choice as leaders as to the ethical or unethical use of technology. And that's always been the case for hundreds of years. I think in the environment that we're living today, I do think one of the roles of a leader is to be an ethical, leader, right? So it's to kind of stand back and kind of really understand the implications of this. And let me tell you what I mean by that, Mark. We hear about leaders talking about sustainability, but on the drop of a hat, when shareholder value is a little bit at odds, they lay off a lot of people. Whereas actually, the way you would go if you're a really ethical leader would be to, well, actually, how can we use these people in a different way based on where we're trying to go into the future? Because it's been shown in so many research programs, including some that I've been involved in, that ultimately these kind of mass layoffs come back to be an ultimate negative effect to the organization over a sustainable period of time. So I'm glad you called it out, Mark. I think let's move away from the sensationalism. Let's think about technology and the use of technology through an ethical and purposeful lens. And let's really focus on that marrying of, the right types of technologies that actually are delivering where we're trying to get to in terms of those organizations.
Okay, so that's a really interesting segue because Mark brings up a very good point. There is a lot of hype going on around AI. I actually am getting tired of it, if I'm frank, looking at LinkedIn and how ChatGPT is going to turn the world upside down, and AI is about to revolutionize the way we cook lunch. It's just getting silly. But, I think one of the things, Barry, that you bring home in the course of the discussion today, as well as what you presented in Poland a few weeks ago, is the fact that, as you say, the workforce, the workplace, these are elements that are changing, that are evolving. So to take it back to a CX context, how do you find, from the perspective of an organization that specializes in recruitment, that's really the bread and butter of CPL, how are customer experience organizations, either on the captive or the outsourced side, responding to these changes in what agents and what employees are looking for versus what perhaps their own requirements are?
Yeah, I mean, I think interestingly, so a couple of things. Obviously, within the broader CPL group, we actually have an outsourcing business in there, so I can probably speak from a broader, perspective, and then also within one of our own businesses, which is called Covalent. I think there's definitely, Peter, a bigger onus now, I would say, on what I would call the purposeful design of the employee value proposition. And what I mean by that is, in totality, what is the total value that an employee will receive from working with my organization, right? So if you think back to maybe 20 years ago, it was all about, perks and benefits, and it was all quite disconnected. I think what we're starting to see is organizations really starting to grab a handle on, well, actually, what is our current value proposition, and what are the kind of elements that we can provide to different cohorts of employees within our organization. And I don't want to simplify it through generations, but let's look at it more through behaviors, right? So let's say there's a cohort of people within my organization that maybe put a greater emphasis on free time and more time, okay? Providing those people with opportunities for, early finishes during the year, etc., has a massive impact on the overall experience of that employee versus, let's say, a cohort that would put greater value on monetary, exchange, right, where a bonus will have a big change to their motivation. So I think the first thing for me really is, these organizations, and only some of them, and I think there's a big opportunity actually for CX businesses in this space to really take control of their overall value proposition for these organizations, purposely design it and involve those people that are going to receive that value proposition within that, because it is a living thing and it's something that needs to evolve over time. And remember, even within all of the organizations that we work with, there are still a large majority of people that are leaving for either poor leadership or poor culture, right? So even within all of the talk we have about things like Great Place to Work and all this kind of stuff, we're still in a situation where we're not actually developing our leaders to be leaders. And then those leaders then are struggling then to, and particularly in the post-COVID world, to really bring value to their own teams and their own employees. So I think the first thing, Peter, is we are starting to see that turn towards a much more structured approach. But I do think there's a lot more work to do. And look, all of you know this, Peter, Mark, you know this very well, is that particularly when we're talking about that B2B and B2C context, the real importance of a focused design approach to the employee experience to drive that customer experience, and, that all comes back to that as well. So I think what I would say in summation, Peter, is some good work happening, but a lot to do, right, in terms of really creating a point of differentiation, right, in some of those organizations around their people proposition.
Okay, Barry, last question. And this is an interesting one because you do bring up the issue about toxic leadership and toxic culture within organizations. This is something that I am actually quite happy on LinkedIn that we're seeing a lot of discussion around, because I think that this is very structural. I think this is a real issue. And it's apparent that this is being talked quite a lot about. But I really think that there's a lot of laggardness. There's a lot of almost stubbornness around organizations not to deal with toxic leaders, not to deal with bad culture in the CX environment. What counsel would you have to proactive organizations that might be suffering from one or both of these, but really don't know how to go about changing it?
Yeah, it's a great question, man. I totally agree with you, actually. There is a lot of talk about it, and oftentimes it's probably the most difficult thing to deal with. I think the first step I would really do is to understand, because I think, look, as in all human situations, there are different flavors, as I like to call it, of toxic cultures and leadership within organizations. And oftentimes those toxic behaviors, interestingly enough, are coming from a lack of support of that leadership group as well, right? So these things work both ways. What we're finding from our own work is that oftentimes where there is a perception of poor leadership, that particular person who's moved into that leadership role hasn't been given the supports or the psychological, resilience to really embrace that role, right? So they're kind of dropped in, and all of a sudden they're expected to be everything. And I think that links to my second part, which is a recognition. And this is a really important thing, a recognition that leaders within our organizations are now also what I would call culture builders, right? So a formal part of their role is actually to create a meaningful culture and transformative experience for the people that work for them. Now, even by making that very clear, defined statement, all of a sudden puts it on the agenda of leaders and of the leadership group there. So that would be the very first thing I would suggest, is to really, number one, explore exactly your flavor of the challenge. And then number two, be very explicit in terms of that. And I hate to use the word softer, so let's use the word human. That be very explicit around the human aspect of a leadership role and give them the tools to be culture builders within their organization.
Well, Barry Winkless, this has been a fantastic discussion. I know that Mark and I are very anxious to catch up with you live in Temple Bar in the not too distant future.
Drinks on me.
All right. Well, in that case, it will be in the very not too distant future. But we really appreciate your time today. Thank you so much for chatting with us. And we look forward to having you back on the CX Files in the not too distant future.
Thanks, Peter. Thanks, Mark.
Thanks.
Take care.
Thanks for listening to the CX Files podcast. We really appreciate your feedback and suggestions. You can reach myself, Mark Hillary, or Peter Ryan via LinkedIn. Please also leave a rating or review on your favourite podcast provider, as that helps more people to find us. As always, we'd like to thank Chris Haig at Traction Media for the CX Files graphics. See you next week.